gentlemen, welcome to Socrates in the City. I have to say that this is a particularly wonderful Socrates in the City because I get to have a conversation with a character named Christian Wiman. Perhaps you've read about him. Anybody here of Christian Wiman? He'll be showing up any minute, and I get to ask him anything I want. Those are the ground rules. I didn't tell him that, but those are the ground rules. A couple of things before we start. Our format is a little bit different from what we normally have. In fact, we're going to be doing more Socrates events that are conversations between two people, and I often will be just one of those two people, just in case you're worried about that. But we're going to be doing that. And tonight, I've read Christian's book, My Bright Abyss: Meditation of a Modern Believer, and it is it's prose poetry, is what it is, which is a coincidence because he's a poet. But it's what I would like to think of as lapidary prose. It is just the kind of thing you could inscribe most of the sentences on granite, and nobody would look at you funny. Very impressive, very thoughtful. I came upon the story of Christian Wiman in this book. I guess it was in the New Yorker magazine, and then everywhere I turned, it seemed, I found more stories on him. I even opened up the Yale Alumni magazine, which they keep sending to me, even though I've never sent them a dime, and by God's grace, I'll never send them a dime. But I have to tell you that there it was, and then I discovered that Christian is going to be teaching at Yale this fall. He's already moved his family to New Haven, and he just took the train from New Haven to New York. I think he's in the room. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Christian Wiman. Christian, really, I can't spend the next hour gushing, but I'm going to try.
You can start.
I can start. Oh, that was good. I really do have to say that your book is unlike anything I've ever read, at least written by a contemporary writer or contemporary poet. It really is the sort of thing that you want to read with a pencil. There's just a lot of thought in there. Before I begin asking you questions, I want to say up front that Christian is himself a poet and was the editor, right? Because you're no longer.
I think I'm editor for 36 more hours.
For another day, is that right? Okay, yeah. Well, is currently, wow, I'm glad we got you in time.
Yeah.
Still is the editor of the extremely prestigious and I would say almost overly well-endowed poetry magazine. See, they don't understand that joke. Let me explain that. Poetry magazine, that was not a vulgar joke. We don't tell those kinds of jokes at Socrates that we know of. It was a joke because a few years ago, Poetry magazine got a gift. This was all over the New York Times. This is a small poetry magazine, and they got a gift of $200 million. Now they get the joke. Let me try that again. Almost overly well-endowed poetry magazine. And so Christian was tasked with spending that money on poetry. And we just don't have time to ask you about that, but that's just, it's just incredible.
It's another story.
So what really struck me with your story and with this tremendous book, which I hope everyone will get a copy of this evening, was that you are a particularly thoughtful person. You are a really terrific poet, and if you knew how much I hated contemporary poetry, you'd be especially flattered and blessed by that. The idea that you had somehow begun to struggle and deal with faith of some sort, it's a gripping story. I don't want to tell that story, but I do want to ask you, my first question is to say, what happened?
What happened? Well, it's very strange to me to find myself talking about faith to groups of audiences around the country as I am doing these days. For a number of years, I thought it was strange to be talking about poetry, given my background.
It is strange.
Yeah. This seems even stranger. I mean, I came from a small town in West Texas called Snyder. It's in far West Texas. It's about 10,000 people. And I grew up in a house with no books. And my only real aesthetic experience when I was growing up was religion. I came from a culture that was saturated in faith. And for all of the negative things that you could say about that faith, and don't get me started, there are a lot of positive things that you could say as well. One is the sort of enveloping world that it gives childhood, and another is the kind of imaginative flair and risk and mercurial nature that it gives childhood. The sense that reality is permeated with something more than itself, that something else is always there. Terrence Malick does a wonderful job of showing this in his movies. That recent movie, Tree of Life, where he shows, those of you who've seen that, he shows a family in Central Texas, Waco, Texas, I believe. And those scenes are among the most beautiful things I've ever seen, because he shows the way in which our lives, all of our lives, you don't have to be in a rural environment, are shot through with moments of timelessness. I don't think you have to be a necessarily religious person to feel that in your life, certainly. I left that place when I was 18, 17, and took off in my Trans Am and drove up to a little school in Virginia, which was all male at the time, called Washington and Lee University. When I was there, I didn't even visit the school. It was all male, which I somehow I hadn't apprehended that when I got there. It was the only school to which I applied. It was the only school that sent me stuff in the mail. I didn't take any of those college entrance course things like the SAT. I didn't take those things. I didn't know about it. It was a different time. And that was a different world. And I got there, and my faith fell away, like a change of clothing. It fell away so easily. I distinctly remember the first atheist that I met, and him telling me just, as casually as he would, announce a culinary preference or something that he didn't believe in God, and I thought that he would be struck dead. He could have started swiveling his head around. I would have been no more surprised. But it all fell away for me, and it fell away for a number of years. And I would never have called myself an unbeliever, but I would have told you I didn't really believe in God per se. I don't meet many poets or artists of any sort who are really sort of dogmatic unbelievers. They all seem to have some susceptibility to something outside themselves that gives them some sympathy to, if not religion per se, at least the world of the spirit. So for years, my only connection to, call it spiritual life, was art. And I gave myself over to making poems and lived all around the world. I just would kind of move around to places where I could manage to write poems. And
I want to cut you off for a second here. I want to get back to the Camaro. No,
Trans Am.
That's
There's
a
a
joke.
big
That's
difference,
a joke.
man.
Oh, Trans Am. Awesome. No, I want to cut you off for a minute. You talk about falling into writing poetry. I don't want to blow your mind, but there are a lot of non-poets in the room. And most people don't fall into writing poetry. And I want to ask you a little bit. I mean, you just make it seem so natural. How did you fall into writing poetry?
yeah, no, I know most people don't. It's worth
Did you want to do
discouraging
that
your
when you were in
children,
high school? When you were in high school, did you
Yeah.
know you wanted to write poems?
No, but I was writing when I was a little kid. I was writing things when I was a little kid, and in fact, this is not anywhere in my book. I've never written about this, I believe, but the first poem I ever published was when I was 7 years old, and I wrote a little poem. We were living in Dallas, Texas. We were going to the First Baptist Church in Dallas, and which at the time was the largest Baptist church in the world. I don't know if that's still true, but I got up out of my seat when they have those altar calls, ask for people to come to be saved. I got up out of my seat, and this is sort of exemplifies my entire life as a sort of the conflict between my artistic life and my religious life. Is that I go to the altar call. My parents don't know what the hell's going on. I'm 7 years old, going down the aisle, and And, they probably thought it was great that I was getting saved. But in fact, what I did was hand the preacher a poem that I had written. And then turned around and ran back up the aisle.
Is this the poem about the chickens and the wheelbarrow after?
That's right, yeah. No, the poem was, I love the Lord and the Lord loves me. I will not forget and neither will he. Nice little rhyme.
Did anybody say we have a budding poet in our midst?
The poem was published in the Southern Baptist Newsletter.
Wow.
So it's probably my biggest publication to date.
You mind saying that again? That's beautiful. It's actually, I mean,
you like that,
even if you had written it today, it would be, I think, wonderful. But the idea that you wrote it when you were 7, say it one more time.
I love the Lord and the Lord loves me. No, I love the Lord and he loves me. I will not forget and neither will he. Very cute. Very cute.
It is. It's very cute.
But yeah, I went to college to get rich. I was an economics major, and I was tired of being poor. I'd seen what being poor was like. I'd had it, and so I set out in those economics courses, and man, I was bored. And,
yeah, I hear you, bro. I was an English major, so I'm with you. I'm down with that boredom stuff.
But I did that until, I took an English course at some point, my sophomore year or something. It was just a requirement. And I started reading poetry for the first time ever. And that was really it. I remember reading very clearly. I got this fellowship to go over to Oxford my junior year, just for part of the year, and I bought a selection of Yeats and Eliot. They were together. And I remember sitting out there and reading those things and just being intoxicated by the sounds of them, just the music of the language.
But this was new to you in college. You had not been raised in that kind of a home.
No. Yeah, it was completely new. I didn't know that there were such a thing as living poets. I didn't at all. Yeah, and so I set out to be a poet.
It's hardly a living.
You're right. Yeah, it did not make me rich. Yeah.
Right. Wow.
Right.
So you just fell into this. I mean, part of the reason I was so fascinated with your book and your stories is this parallels my story a little bit. I was not raised in a home where we read poetry. My parents are sitting in the front row, and they hate books and literature of every kind. They forced me to watch Sanford and Son, and God has somehow healed that, and we're in our lives. But anyway, that's pretty interesting to me that you just discovered on your own this love for poetry, and I mean, that's where I had interrupted you. I don't mean to make you digress, but I think just to explain that, you are a full-blown poet. You've been not only successful as a poet, but you've been charged with editing, as I mentioned, this tremendously prestigious and important poetry magazine. So, okay, so where were you in the story? I don't remember.
I don't remember either, but I can pick up somewhere.
But I was curious what it was that, so you were sort of floating along in a world where you didn't really know anyone who knew anyone who was the kind of a Christian that you'd been raised, but at the same time you said artists are open to something beyond themselves.
Exactly, yeah. And I would have conversations with people at times, always artists, very secular artists, about matters of faith, but it was very easy to talk to them because we all would easily denigrate people who had faith. We all agreed that they were idiots.
Be careful, several of those idiots are in this room.
I'm one of those people now. I'm one of those people.
No, I mean real idiots. not just people of faith.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is Rich here? Look.
Yeah, it took several things for me to. There's a narrative that's told about me, and that when I read these stories in the press that you mentioned, that, and I've probably contributed to that with things that I've written, where I had a sudden turn back to God, and my life completely changed. I didn't really believe in the notion of conversions. I don't really believe it happens like that. I believe. The way that I talk about it in the book is that I finally assented to a faith that had long been latent within me. That it was a matter of simply turning towards something that was already there. letting it disclose itself within me. And there were, however, some real shocks. As I said, I had set out my whole life to write poems. And I mean, I wrote other things too. I wrote a lot of prose, but my passion was in writing poems.
Could you keep it down? I want to hear those people in the hall. Just hang on a second. Hold on. Give them a chance. Give them a chance. All right. That's enough. Thank you. All right.
So I had at some point, it was actually before I took over the editorship of poetry, I found myself unable to write at all. And I've gone through long droughts in the past years, but this was the first one that actually stretched, I guess, longer than a year. This went for 3 years.
So you were teaching during this time?
I moved to Chicago to teach at Northwestern, and then I was there for 1 year and got the job at Poetry Magazine. So that started 10 years. I was at Poetry Magazine for exactly 10 years. So I couldn't write anything at all, and it was I was in a deep depression because of that. I just couldn't perceive the world around me. Any artist will tell you this. You don't make art because you have an idea and then you want to express it. You make art because it's the way you translate your experience. It's the only way that you're able to be in the world. And if you don't have that, it's like having your language taken away. You go mute, and all those things that would ordinarily come out of you are sort of impacted and corrosive, and they begin to eat at you. And that's what happened to me. And then I met the woman who's now my wife. We've been married almost 10 years, and I fell in love it was very sudden. And we were married for about 7 months, and then I got a really bad diagnosis of a really bad cancer, which is a long story, but I won't tell the whole thing, but it led to a bone marrow transplant and the whole really long number of years of difficulties. And all of that shocked me in such a way that I needed to give a form to my faith. I knew when I met my wife Danielle that I had some kind of faith, some kind of access to life that I hadn't had before. And we would even find ourselves, I talk about this in the book, sometimes saying prayers at night, even though neither of us had done this in years, and it was bizarre for us to do it. We felt very self-conscious doing it, but we found ourselves doing it before our meals at night. And this was before the diagnosis. But then after that, I needed some form for the faith. And so I began going to a church that was just up the street, a United Church of Christ, UCC church.
Did that feel awkward for you? I mean, just
it's
again, coming from
awkward.
the world
in
which you were swimming there, it's just not the thing to do to go to church. But you felt awkward, yet you did it anyway.
It was at once, incredibly awkward. I still feel awkward in church. I still feel ill at ease, and I actually felt that way in childhood. I was bored out of my skin in childhood, and church is often very boring. It depends. So much of Protestantism depends on the preacher. It's a real problem. We could talk about it another time, but
Well, that's really why you should go to Redeemer. Tim Keller's fabulous. Yeah. Is he here? No.
I've lost my train of thought. But
That's my job.
Yeah. You pick it up here.
You just say you began. I mean, it sounds to me, again, this book, there's so much in there. It's so dense. It's like a fruitcake in a good way. It is very dense. There's just a lot there, and yet there's a narrative. And in this narrative, you talk about this. It's sort of a fitful. If drifting towards something can be fitful, I don't know, but it doesn't seem. In other words, you don't have a conversion. In fact, even now, as I read the book and you talk about your faith, it's a just very interesting kind of faith. It's not typical, but it sounds like that was the process. And it was you and your wife somehow, oddly, were compelled towards something, but it doesn't sound like you really knew what.
Yeah, I mean, she would say very different things. She would talk, and she also talks about her faith in a very different way than I do. So it's not the same. She has much less anguish than I do. I have a.
Is she
what are
a
you
poet
say?
or an economist? What is she?
No, I wish she were an economist.
Yeah.
No, she's a poet. She's a poet. But I feel like I never felt the pain of unbelief until I began to believe. I mean, all of those years when I didn't really think of God, when it was sort of this, little slight noise maybe in the background, it didn't really bother me at all. I mean, I was enjoying my life like everybody else, going through my life, and it didn't bother me. People think that there's this traumatic event, and that causes you to somehow it slices into you, and it blares at you, and it says change your life, and that's actually not my experience. In my experience, when you have some real trauma like that, and somebody says, "Hey, buddy, you're going to die," what happens is the world goes quiet, and what you realize is that you walk. It's like Ulysses. It's like Joyce's Ulysses. That book is the tumult of one man's mind during the course of one day, and our minds. The greatness of that book is he makes you feel the noise of your mind all the time. It's just going, 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 going. You never stop it. You never stop it. Well, when you're told you're going to die, it stops like that. And suddenly it is deadly quiet. And you can suddenly hear things that you couldn't hear before. And it's a pretty profound experience. There's a Jewish theologian whose name I'm forgetting, a scholar who actually has written something about this and traces it all the way back to how the word was delivered to humans. But that was my experience during that time.
I want to read Marilyn Robinson, author of Gilead, has praised your book. Actually, it's Mary Carr there's a quote. She says that your spiritual ancestors are C.S. Lewis and Thomas Merton. Like Lewis, he, meaning you, is surprised by the joy of falling in love, and like Merton, he captures the smugness that can poison some atheists as it does some believers. And I thought there were a couple of parts in your book where you're talking about your faith, and it was just fascinating that you were thinking, what you seem to do throughout the book is you look at faith so sharply, so clearly, that you can see where faith itself can roll over into a kind of smugness, in a kind of something dogmatic. But there are many people who are making that kind of observation in our culture. I mean, it's the endless noise of that people of faith are stupid, but in your careful analysis of this thing that you call faith, you also talk about rolling in the other way. The idea people who are somehow proud about. Well, you wrote about it, but somehow that there can be a pride in not knowing, a kind of strange self-exalting pride in saying, I don't know, or whatever. And you write about that a lot in the book. I mean, it seems like on every other page.
Yeah, that's a real tension for me. The saying these days is I'm spiritual but not religious. And that it's a sort of an out. I mean, I would have said it myself. I wouldn't have uttered the words, but I understand them completely. It is a sort of out in a way. And as I said, until you get something that confronts you, that makes your life demand some sort of structure, it's fine to sort of free float around without a creed, let's say. But then you need a creed. Then suddenly you need something fixed. I think it's easy to become, particularly for artists maybe, but maybe for others as well, you can find that the energy of your art comes from absence or destitution. Emily Dickinson has a wonderful phrase, sumptuous destitution. The notion of and you mentioned Marilyn Robinson. She has her books, her Housekeeping is my favorite of her books. For need can blossom into all the compensation it requires. For when do we know anything so utterly as when we lack it? Here again is the foreshadowing. The world will be made whole. She goes on and talks. It's this absolutely beautiful passage near the end of that book. But you can become, I have found, so addicted to the energy of that absence that you don't ever let yourself feel the presence that's in your life. And Marianne Moore very succinctly puts it, without my loneliness, I would be more lonely, so I keep it. It's perfect. It's perfect.
That's so profound, I have no idea what that means. In a good way. You seem to vacillate in the book, I guess, on your journey toward the faith that you have, but also in the faith that you now have, back and forth between saying you need some kind of a creed, but the moment you grab onto it too much, you kill it. How do you deal with that tension? I mean, that's all through the book, and I think it's important to look at that, and so I applaud you now, and while I was reading it, for being so rigorous in analyzing faith, and again, how it can roll this way or roll this way. But how do you deal with that tension? In other words, if somebody says to you, do you believe X, Y, and Z, yes or no? Do you believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus, yes or no, or doesn't it matter? There's so many questions like that divide, and I think that division can be important. It's important to know, do I believe this or don't I? Or why do I believe this, or maybe I shouldn't believe this? But you seem to come out more in the book in talking about the idea that we don't want to grab dogma or creeds too much. It's kind of like saying, what does a poem mean? And you say, well, if I could tell you what it meant, I wouldn't have had to write the poem.
Right.
So I didn't come up with that. So, but the idea that a creed or there's use for it, but it's limited. And our faith shouldn't be limited to that. But how do you deal with that? Because I think it's so easy to err on either side of that, I guess.
Yeah, I think the great. We live in a culture of reason, and we are replicating the great age of reason. The fallacy is that you're going to think your way to something that you believe. You're going to rationalize all of this. You're going to figure it out. And then you're going to reach a point at which you can assent to it. You're going to come up with a set of logical propositions to which you can assent. And Thomas Merton used to say that trying to solve the problem of God is like trying to see your own eyeballs. It doesn't work. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, whom you know intimately, said only he who obeys believes. That belief comes after you make the motion of obedience. I talked before about feeling something, not as if I was having some sort of great turning in my life, a big conversion, but merely sort of assenting to something that had long been latent within me. I think it is that subtle of an experience. I don't know how to resolve the tension between dogma and call it mysticism or an experiential religion. I find it to be a constant and very frustrating tension.
But you obviously feel that there is a role for creed or dogma. Otherwise, it becomes so attenuated that what is anyone talking about?
Exactly. And how do you bind a community together? Faith seems to me communal. It seems to me that any time that my faith becomes purely personal, it leads me to despair. I find it going inward to despair. That I need other people around. That Christ is always stronger in our brother's heart than in our own. Again, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Very, very powerful idea. If the word Christ bothers you, then just substitute something else for it. You could say maybe joy is always stronger in our brother's heart than in our own. There's something that we need to see in other people in order for our experience to have validity. But I find this to be a frustrating, endlessly difficult question, and I don't have an answer for it. And I don't run a church.
You don't what?
I don't run a church.
Don't run a church. A lot of people who run churches don't run churches. Well, thank you. When you say you're anguished Your wife's not so anguished. Why are you anguished? I mean, my instinct is to think that you would be anguished in the same way that I was and am anguished when I came to faith, because most of the people in my universe would simply think I'm crazy. And so there's an anguish because you're trying to represent something, but it's nearly impossible to explain, and so you're just kind of stuck. Is that your anguish?
No, I don't feel that. I'm not. I admit I'm bothered by that, but I feel lonely sometimes because I live in a secular world for the most part. Although now I'm just joined the faculty of a divinity school, so that's about to change.
But it's Yale Divinity School, so have no fear.
They would argue that.
There are one of two people of faith hiding, and I can out them to you. I know. Miroslav Volf is a type of Christian. That's about it, I think. But anyway, go ahead.
No, the anguish for me is simply not feeling God's presence. It's simply not feeling it. It's being an unbeliever most of the time.
But okay, now, so I want to stop you there. You're equating belief with feeling.
Well, maybe I use my words imprecisely. Call it faith, if that's better. I usually think of belief as having objects, the bodily resurrection of Christ or what have you. I think of faith as not having a definite object. That you can be a person of faith and not necessarily be able to articulate what it is that you have faith in. Belief seems to me to introduce the idea of objects. What do I believe in? Does that clarify?
But
that?
isn't it possible to believe in something bad? In other words, there are plenty of people living in the world who have faith in something that is, a bad thing to believe in.
Sure.
And so you want to dissuade them of that faith. So you don't want to portray faith as just generally good. I mean, doesn't it have to have an object? What do you mean when you say it doesn't have an object?
No, I don't think it has to have an object. Unless you can somehow say that God is an object. I mean, God is, in the way that Simone Weil said, we must believe in God in every way possible except that he does not exist, because we have not reached the point at which he might exist. Somehow God has not, we have not come to the point at which we can perceive God.
By the way,
and so that's a kind of objectlessness.
Yeah.
I mean, she was a Jew who never quite converted to Catholicism, could never bring herself to convert to Catholicism. A great writer. I recommend Gravity and Grace if you haven't. A little book of mostly aphorisms collected after her death.
How do you pronounce her name again?
Weil. W-E-I-L.
I've never known until this moment. Thank you very much. I can spell it, but I can't pronounce it. Well, I still think, when you talk about faith, so it's not a transitive verb, doesn't need an object. I mean,
I think a lot of people use it that way, but I would like, in my own life, this is the way that I've defined it, tried to define it for myself, that I think you can have faith without an object. I do. And I think there can even be Christians who have faith without an object, that they find themselves incapable of believing in, say, the dogma that you get in churches. I find.
Well, but there's good dogma and there's bad dogma.
There's good dogma
and so,
sure, but
but isn't it our job to determine, if it's good or bad before we give ourselves to it? You don't just want to believe in something because you're told to believe in it. At some point, obviously, you want to determine that this is actually true, or I think this is true. But there are plenty of people believing bad things. I think, and you point that out in your book, actually.
Well, I guess we could draw a distinction between noble ways of being, being in abeyance, having faith in abeyance, or being something like that, and ignoble ways. Or I think a writer like Simone Weil, and I think a lot of the artists that I know, are people of faith. I don't know how else to describe them. But they're certainly not Christians, and they're not Orthodox Jews, and they're not Buddhists, and they're not Muslims. And so I'm really reluctant to say that they have bad faith. They seem to me to be living lives that are exemplary in some way. They apply themselves to something that seems to be mystical and full of meaning. And
Would they describe it as faith?
yes, oh yeah, they would describe it as faith. But the minute you introduce a religion, it all falls apart.
How's it different from saying I'm spiritual but not religious? Isn't that?
I don't think it is different, really.
Okay.
I think that's what I mean. I think there are people who can. I mean, that phrase has been ruined. It's sort of become laughable in the culture. But there are people who live that way. That's what I meant.
Yeah.
The distinction I meant to draw. Who live that way honorably, and there are others who don't. There can be a kind of rigorous spirituality, and there can be a kind of flaccid spirituality.
Is it possible that that kind of faith without an object could lead to faith with an object?
That's probably the hope. That was certainly Simone Weil's hope. I know that's my hope. I mean, that's always. I feel mostly that I live in that state of faith without an object. I'm constantly trying to articulate to myself what it is I believe in. I don't think a lot of people go through this. I have a sentence in that book that I can't tell whether this is something I'm called to, or this is some fundamental pride in myself. I say that sometimes we're called to unbelief. Sometimes God calls a person to unbelief in order that faith can take new forms. Maybe that's true. I mean, I wrote it. Maybe it's. I don't know if I have to believe in it. Maybe it's true at one point, and maybe at another point it's pure pride. I'm not sure.
You talk about the centrality of God to being fully human, and you say someplace that in a way, loving God or knowing God is a precursor to fully being able to love other people, or maybe even said loving Christ. And some of your friends or someone was put off by that, and I think a lot of people would be put off by that.
I would be put off by that.
I'm put off by it now. Let's end this.
I'm appalled.
But I guess, what do you mean by that? And I suspect maybe you talk about your own suffering and about Christ being in the midst of suffering. That seems to be a big part of your own faith. Is it related to that idea?
No.
Strike two for me.
I don't think so. I think that idea, the notion that you can't really experience the love of other people until you've experienced the love of God, or divine love leads to human love, is not mine. It's from a Catholic theologian, Hans Urs von Balthasar, and the reviewer in the New York Times attributed it to me, and so there was. Some
the
confusion.
Times isn't really big on this religion stuff.
Right.
They get a lot of stuff wrong. But
so
they're
there was
in process.
some confusion.
They're seeking.
Yeah.
Okay.
But no, I don't believe
so it was
that.
Hans and not you.
It seems a ridiculous idea.
Well, it's not ridiculous if you think that, if you think that all goodness comes of God and that everything that's good is of God, then the love that two human beings share, whether they know God on any level, that if there's anything good in that love, it is of God. But they just wouldn't articulate it that way. I was wondering if that's what you were getting at in saying that. I'm just not sure why you said that, but it seemed very important that your love for your wife and this process somehow were related.
Well, that's what in my own life, I never experienced divine love until I fully experienced human love. It's the reverse of Balthasar's idea. I understand what you're saying, but that seems to me perilously close to saying that someone can be a Christian without knowing it, like Albert Camus or something. That he was, he's someone I admire enormously. Great writer, seems to me. And people have said, oh, Camus, and also a very noble, moral person. And everybody says, oh, Camus maybe he was one of those Christians without knowing it. Karl Rahner used to have that phrase, not specifically, but for Camus, but for others. And I think that's a dangerous thing to say because it's sort of you're saying, oh, Camus didn't know his own mind. He didn't know. We can be above him and see maybe something overarching, but I just think I wouldn't do that.
You sure? Well, this gets into really deep stuff. I'd like to keep it a little more shallow. So
Okay,
hang on a
that's
second. You say you do in your book. I mean, you seem to kind of go back and forth, but then you a couple of places clearly say that you feel that not just God is important, but somehow Christ is important. That's like a deal breaker for most people, I think.
Yeah.
Is God can be non-threatening, sort of an energy force that lets me do what I like, and then when you get to that Christ thing, now suddenly you've gone from spirituality into religion or something unpleasant or dogmatic, and why does it have to be that for you? Unless you're, Deepak Chopra, who can make talk about Christ consciousness, which is just as meaningless as God. And so I assume you're not talking about Christ consciousness, but you're talking about that was more Henry Kissinger. I apologize, but you do talk about the centrality of Christ, and that's the it's the big one hanging out there. What do you do with that?
Yeah, for me, I guess I have a couple of answers. No doubt, if I had been raised somewhere else, I wouldn't talk about Christ so much. You have to speak the language that you've been given. There's a wonderful theologian, George Lindbeck, who says you can no more be religious in general than you can speak language in general. It just doesn't work like that. You've got to have a language, and my language is Christianity, and I could change it, but according to Lindbeck, I could maybe learn the language of Buddhism, or I could learn the language of Judaism, to name two things that I'm very attracted to, two cultures which really interest me. But I would always have a really strong accent. And you would know it, and it wouldn't really fit.
But you do make it sound. I mean, it seems like you're having it both ways, because if it's just a language, I mean, at the end of the day, a word is a word. So I can translate a word into German or French, but it's still, we're talking about something specific. And in other words, if belief in Christ becomes so attenuated as to mean nothing, it's just a language. That's part of why I think the historicity of biblical faith is important. It's not the only thing, but it's important, because otherwise it does become so attenuated that it becomes hopelessly vague. So I don't know.
Agree. It's absolutely important within my religion. But do I believe that a Hindu person needs to convert to Christianity? I do not. And nor would I try to convert that person.
Do you think that there's anybody out there who needs to convert to Christianity or to anything? In other words, because again, you're positing the idea that there are good things, beyond the Christian faith, but there are also bad things. And how does one begin to make those distinctions?
Oh, I think Christ is calling people all the time, and calling people who don't have any experience of Him. I think it can be a very difficult thing to hear, and takes some real effort to hear sometimes. You have to learn to hear it. But yes, I do indeed think that Christ is crucial to faith, absolutely crucial to my faith, to any notion I have of God, which is God made human and suffering as we suffer. But I will not translate that into some absolute notion that excludes other people. It seems to me wrong. I believe Christ is present in every permutation of reality that we know. I believe Christ is present in Hinduism, present in Buddhism, present everywhere. But I don't think that people have to turn their lives over to Him in the way that conservative Christianity teaches. Or even the liberal Protestant churches that I go to, maybe they teach it too. It may be why I'm a bad spokesman for Christianity. But there you have it.
You're pretty bad. Now look, what's interesting is I think you'd be surprised. I think a lot of conservative Christians would agree quietly with most of what you're saying, because I think they've begun to see the limits of certain kinds of expressions, that they seem more tribalistic or more. I mean, what I couldn't help, and I don't think it's just because you're a poet, but in your book, what we're talking about is going back and forth between sort of a noun sense of the world and a verb sense of the world, right? And artists are into process and verb, and that's sort of more feminine, and then the kind of patriarchal, dogma, truth with a capital T, it's more noun. And what you're saying, which I certainly think is true, is that real faith is both. And that if you the Pharisees famously, they were legalists, and Jesus kept rebuking them pretty harshly and saying that, yeah, you're getting all that stuff right, and yet you're totally wrong.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating that you can get all that stuff right and be totally wrong. As far as God's concerned, it's pretty scary, but they were not willing to, shift their paradigm. Let's put it that way. And I think but I think that's exactly the case. That's exactly where we are today. Nothing is new, but in your book, you just so beautifully deal with that. And I think part of the reason I wanted to talk to you is because I don't see anyone really talking about that as bravely as you've done. Because you're not trying to be, you're not quote unquote Bishop John Spong or somebody who's openly heretical. Is John here? Good, good. But I just, it's interesting because at the end of the day, you're flirting with what's perceived as heresy.
Oh, yeah.
And Bonhoeffer talked about that. That's one of the reasons I love Bonhoeffer, is that it's this idea that we're talking about truth. And so we have to be free to explore what is truth and have to be careful. And it doesn't mean that 1 + 1 ever equals 2. And yet, we want to be... We want to be careful not to pretend that the whole world revolves around statements and tenets of faith, that there's more to it. And I really think you do that so brilliantly, and I'm very happy that you've written about this. What's the reaction been to the book? Because I
it's been overwhelmingly positive. Honestly, I wrote this book. I've been attacked some places, but mostly it's been very positive.
I think the New York Times, it was a very snarky,
it was a little snarky,
an itchy kind of snarky review.
Yeah, but still, what do you mean? It was fine. I mean, that it got reviewed in the Times. That they're reviewing a book of religion in the Times. A book on religion. I was glad it was there. I was very upset with that one aspect of the review. But I'm overwhelmed with the number of people contacting me. I can't quite handle it.
The review, I just have to say, the review in the Times, there were parts of it that were utterly stupid. And I say that in love. But it's really, it makes you cringe when you read something. You just say, I know this is stupid because I know more about what he's talking about than what he's talking about. He compared you to
Joel Osteen.
To Joel Osteen.
Right.
I mean, I thought, wow, was he like on deadline and he just didn't have time to, that was, anyway, it just needs to be said about how tremendously snarky and ridiculous some of that stuff was. But anyway, most of the response has been...
Yeah, the response has been overwhelming. And there's a poet, Mark Strand, here in the city, once said, someone asked him, what it was like being a famous poet, and he said, it's like being famous in your family.
Yes. It's a kind of private fame.
Right, that's right.
Yeah.
And you write a nonfiction book, and suddenly everybody's interested. It's very odd for me because I actually I'm a poet. I mean, that's what I think about all the time. That's what I care about, and yet suddenly you get a lot of attention for a book that I wrote because I couldn't write any poems. That's not true, actually. That's not. It's literally true. I went away to Texas and rented this place, had this place for a while, and was unable to write, and so I began writing these little prose passages to pass the time. And they were all about faith. I couldn't stop them from being about faith, and that's how the book started. And then the book sort of accreted over the next 7 years, so it was slowly written.
But it's true. I mean, it's tremendously poetic and super precise language. You're no Jack Kerouac. Yeah, it's beautiful. It's beautiful, and it requires reading carefully. I was just thrilled at some of your the folks that you're mentioning. I mean, you talk about Wallace Stevens, you talk about Cormac McCarthy, all of these people. I feel like I knew Cormac McCarthy before. In 1983, I knew his work before anyone had heard of him, and somebody described him as Faulkner with the volume turned up, which is about right. But just that somebody as well read as you would be exploring the subject of faith this way. I don't know, who are you talking to about this out there? And that's the first question. And then the second question is, what will you be teaching at Yale Divinity School?
I'm talking to a lot of different, I still get invited to a lot of, to poetry-related things or literary things. So they're very secular audiences. And I think they're very curious to talk about faith. I find people are very curious, even if they feel put off by the discussion, the sort of the ironclad kind of way that the discussion is conducted in public in this country. I find people, particularly young people, are desperate to have some language for their feelings of trying to find meaning in their lives, and just desperate for it. And so I'm talking to a lot of different people like that. I talk to religious groups that I never would have been in front of in the past, and that's very gratifying to me, very interesting. I don't find it combative. And actually, if it is combative, I just shut down. I'm not, Marilyn Robinson has another great line from Gilead. She has a preacher say, "Nothing true can be said about God from a posture of defense." It seems to me very true. These arguments that go on between the neo-atheists or what have you, the fundamentalists or what have you, they seem to me so boring I cannot even pay attention. And so the minute it becomes an argument, I'm through. So the conversations are they're great. I think there's some other people that I mentioned in that book that you may not ever come across. Fannie Howe is a wonderful novelist, a religious sensibility. She's not necessarily thought of as a religious writer, but she's someone who's very great. Those of you who haven't read Marilyn Robinson, she's a very great writer. I think one of the great writers of our time, and especially housekeeping. Richard Wilbur, those of you, if you're not familiar with poetry, he would be a great place to start.
Oh, he's great. He's great.
Yeah.
He's readable.
Yeah, it's very readable. I was thinking
He's
about
brilliant and readable.
I was thinking about you asked me, how do you know if when God is calling you? He has these lines: "Joy's trick is to supply dry lips with what can cool and slake, leaving them dumbstruck also with an ache nothing can satisfy." Isn't that beautiful? I mean, even if you feel like you've never had the call of God, fine. You've probably had the call of joy, of some sense of reality spilling out of its boundaries. And the weird thing about that experience is that it leaves you with the feeling of being overwhelmingly happy, joyful, and yet this seam of sadness woven through it. And it's the moment elegizing itself, because we sort of live in the past.
When you talk about Protestant churches depending so much on the preacher, I mean, it's interesting because a lot of great Christian writers have tended to be Catholic, because I think Catholics have a much more incarnational view of the world. It's why their churches, at least up until recently, were not ugly. If that's my wife, I'm not here, by the way. And
I knew someone who was giving a reading, and their phone went off, and she took the
call.
call.
Actually,
she took the call.
Can you imagine actually choosing that ringtone? I don't know who that is, but I'm sure it's a friend of mine. I know, or a future friend, or perhaps now a former friend. But what were we talking about? Oh yeah, T.S. Eliot. No, we were talking about this idea of. But the idea is that Catholics, I mean, Gerard Manley Hopkins is a great example, but they have a less, I would say that Protestantism, especially Protestant evangelicalism, falls often into this hyper-enlightenment rationalistic view of reality, ironically, where they think of faith is I believe this and this and this and this, and you need to believe this and this and this and this. And if you don't, you're out. If you do, you're in, and that's it.
Yeah.
Whereas Catholics tend to have a more holistic incarnational view. In other words, because of there's mystery, they think that art is important. They think that God is in everything. It's not. It's interesting because you can have heresy in either of those directions. But just the poem in your book, I can't remember who wrote it about the grapefruit. Who is that?
Oh, that's Craig Arnold. Yeah, he was a poet who died. He was a friend of mine. But it's a poem about him having a grapefruit for breakfast.
But it's so. I mean, I have to say, and folks can get the book just for that poem. It is so great. All he does is describe with truly exquisite language, what it is to eat a grapefruit. And it doesn't seem, in talking about it now, that it's possible to be anything wonderful. But it is so. I don't know if he uses the word opalescent, but his writing is opalescent, and it is just so magnificent. But the reason I bring that up is because I'm just kind of hungry right now. But the reason I bring that up seriously is that what is it about that poem? There's nothing overtly or explicitly about anything beyond the world of the grapefruit or this world, but because it's so precise and beautiful, it somehow seems to point beyond itself to whether it's God and it just seems to be luminescent, to point to something transcendent, which I think all good art does. And he's writing about a grapefruit. It's just.
Well, that's exactly what I mean by.
I finally got it. Okay.
Yeah. I think that's the perfect example of someone who seems to me to have be living, or have lived, because Craig is dead. A kind of spiritual life that had no object. He didn't. I don't think Craig had a religious bone in his body, and I'm certainly we never talked about that. And that poem, though, ramifies with meaning. It ends with a little pause, a little emptiness. He described the whole poem as the description of simply cutting and eating a grapefruit. A pause, a little emptiness. Each year harder to live within. Each year harder to live without. It's beautiful, so almost Buddhist sense of being inside and outside of a moment. For me, that's why art is absolutely crucial to religious experience, because those are the moments when I experience God, and it seems to me a poem like that lets me do it, and it's by someone who wasn't himself religious.
Well, I mean, again, it gets to this division that, if it's all about noun and truth and dogma, story can't be just about bullet points. You have to believe these theological tenets. There's something about story which is, by definition, a process, so you can't nail it down. It's in movement. There's a narrative. There's a passage of time. There's cause and effect. And somehow you can communicate things through art that you can't communicate through creeds. But to say that there are a lot of people, artists, who would say, well, I just think all creeds are stupid, and it's all about process. And I would say that's as limited as saying that creed is everything, and I don't care about your stupid art. And I don't mean specifically your stupid art. I mean stupid art in general. Yes, I did. You caught me. I think you didn't answer that second question a while ago about what you'll be teaching at Yale Divinity School. What will you be teaching there, since they don't let you talk about God in any real way?
This is the next chapter of my life. Yeah, I'm teaching it. I actually work for the Institute of Sacred Music. Wow. I have a dual appointment with the Yale Divinity School, and so it's permanent. That's what I'm going to be doing from now on. And I'm teaching just one course this fall called Poetry and Faith, and then in the spring I'm teaching a course called Accidental Theologians. So people who are doing theology without meaning to. Flannery O'Connor's letters, or some of these books that I've been mentioning, Simone Weil or Fanny Howe. And then in the future, I'm going to pair up with musicians and teach courses, and it's just we're inventing it as we go. It's not a position that has existed before, and so I'm inventing the courses, and they're sort of letting me do it, and I feel incredibly, incredibly lucky to be there.
Do you believe in luck?
That's funny. I wish my wife were here. She would laugh. I think it's funny.
Well,
She just
okay, then
reprimanded me for the same damn thing.
Before we, I'm glad I can channel her. Before we go, I just want you to respond to, you realize, of course, that Flannery O'Connor famously said, if the Eucharist is a symbol, then I say, the hell with it.
Right.
And John Updike, in, I don't know if it was 1959 or 1960, in his poem Seven Stanzas at Easter, talks about the importance of bodily resurrection, the idea that it actually happened bodily. So here are two artists. In the case of Updike, definitely wouldn't think of him as any kind of dogmatic Christian, but both of whom are at some point saying that if it's merely metaphor, if there's not a hard object, a real thing, that sort of they're saying the hell with it. What do you make of that side of the coin?
Oh, wow! We're going to end on this.
No, of course not.
I agree.
We're going to sing. I don't know if you realize that.
No, I agree. I find that if in my own life, if I think of the resurrection just metaphorically, if I think of it just the church perpetuating into current times, then yeah, there's not much there to Christianity. That you need the bodily resurrection. So
that's crazy talk. You understand?
Yeah.
You understand? You just lost everybody. Can't believe an intelligent person
right
would
at
believe
the end
that.
of it. Right at the end of
and
the
you'd admit it publicly.
talk.
Incredible. Charlie Rose was going to have you on, by the way. Incredible. Let's end here. Let me say this. I think that the work you're doing, definitely in this book, and then it sounds wonderfully ongoing at Yale, is important because almost no one is doing it, being willing to rigorously think these things through. It's why I love Bonhoeffer, and I'm happy to know that you know him and love him. And even reading through your book, I felt like it's so Bonhoeffer-like, because Bonhoeffer was in the same way. You couldn't pin him down as this or this or this or that. He just was, I was going to say free spirit, but that's such a horrible cliche. I'd like to think of a nice cliche to end on. It really is interesting to me that so few people are doing the kind of work you're doing. And I think it's why so many folks want to read Bonhoeffer's work, because there just isn't a lot of it out there. So maybe I can close by thanking you for writing this book, which is just spectacular. And somehow I'd like to have you back on the show, but it's not a show. But I'd like to have you back because there is so much to talk about. I mean, in the book, I underlined so much. There's so much else I want to talk to you about. But we'll end it there. Before you applaud, let me say that as soon as we're done, Christian will hang around to sign copies of his books at that table. Please be orderly, because I know many of you are going to want to get your books signed. The rest of us can skip upstairs to the dinner. I hope you will. We'll be starting pretty quickly, so don't linger too long down here. We'll be getting started pretty quickly. And I can say that I think there'll be food already plated. Feel free to eat it. We'll just assume you've prayed quietly. But feel free to start eating, because we won't have time to begin things officially. We really do, I really do mean it, that I'd love to have you back. I think that very few people are having conversations, anything like this, and it's important for us to explore. So I want to applaud you again for bravely exploring these themes, and maybe we can literally applaud you right now. Thank you.